10 wolves. That's what Mara Connicade counted outside her cabin that night. 10 shadows moving like smoke against the snow, circling the only light left burning in that whole frozen world. Her hands, rough from work and worry, trembled around the lantern. Its glow painted the frosted glass a warm, living gold, while the wind outside hissed like a cornered snake. For 6 long months, she had prayed for the silence to break with the sound of her son's footsteps. 6 months of listening to her own heart echo in an empty house. Instead, the wilderness sent howls, low, uneven, the sound of pure hunger, the sound of winter closing its teeth around her little patch of earth. The pack moved like ghosts through the drifts, their eyes flickering like embers in the dark. Their fur was silvered by a mean sliver of moon, their bodies rising and falling in a slow, hypnotic rhythm that made the night itself feel alive and angry. Every breath she took fogged the glass, blurring her own reflection into the storm. A tired woman made of waiting. That's all she was now. Somewhere out there, under that suffocating white blanket, the land she and her boy, Eli, had broken with their own hands now slept under 6 feet of frozen grief. The creek was gone. The corral was gone. The half-built fence where his hammer still hung, rusting in the cold, was gone. She tried to tell herself the wolves were just after the horses, that nature was only hungry, not haunted. But then the smallest one stepped into the lantern's reach. It was limping, favoring its right forepaw, as though remembering an old hurt. Her pulse, which had been beating a slow drum of sorrow for months, suddenly stopped. Cold. Something glimmered on its neck. A thin strip of rawhide knotted twice, shining wet and dark in the cold. No wild thing wore a collar, not unless a human hand had tied it there. Her heart, frozen for so long, jolted like a thawing river. She pressed her palm flat against the cold glass, her breath catching in her throat. Eli. The name escaped her lips before she could swallow it back. It was half prayer, half a scream of disbelief. The wolf lifted its head at the sound. Snowflakes caught in its fur like tiny broken stars. The others paused behind it, 9 other shapes, 10 breaths held in one silent, watching circle. The little flame inside her lantern quivered. For a single impossible moment, she felt the entire wilderness inhale. A single, long, deep breath that seemed to carry her son's voice on the wind. Then the storm roared back to life, flinging snow against the windows so hard the light scattered into 100 tiny pieces, and the ring of wolves dissolved back into the hungry dark. Mara lowered the lantern, listening. Her own heartbeat was louder than the wind now. In the lean-to, the horses stamped and rattled their chains, a warning she chose to ignore. She unlatched the heavy door and stepped out into the drift. The snow swallowed her boots with a soft, final hiss. The cold bit clean through her coat, but she didn't feel it. She didn't care. She needed proof. Paw prints circled the yard like loops of a question that had no answer. They were pressed deep where the heavy bodies had stood, waiting. And right in the middle of them, half buried near the porch rail where the small wolf had stood, something narrow caught the lantern light, a rawhide thong, freshly cut. One end was darkened, as if it had been singed by a fire. She lifted it, her own breath clouding around her face in a white puff. The leather was still warm, not from an animal. It was warm from friction. It carried the faint, sharp smell of smoke, of a campfire, and something else. Something achingly human. Her throat tightened into a knot of iron. All at once, the past 6 months, all the grief, all the waiting, it all collapsed into one single, trembling thought. He had been here. Somewhere out in that raging storm, her boy was still breathing. And the wild, the very thing she thought had taken him, was keeping watch over him. She clutched the piece of leather to her chest, the warmth of it seeping into her skin, and turned her face toward the endless, howling white. "Bring him home," she whispered to the wind. The prairie answered with a single, high-pitched cry, a note so thin and lonely it might have been her own heart echoing back at her. When it faded, she went back inside. She hung the piece of rawhide on the nail by the door, right where his coat used to be, and she kept the lantern burning until the horizon bled from black to gray. She didn't sleep. She just watched the snow fall and waited for the wolves to come back. Morning crept in like a pale ghost, washing the snowfields in a dull, flat silver. The air smelled of frozen wood and the ashes of last night's fire. Mara pushed open the cabin door, her body stiff and sore from a night without sleep. The lantern still burning low behind her, like a trapped piece of the sun. The world was so quiet you could hear the roof beams creak and the slow, lonely drip of thaw from the eaves. The horses were calm again, their breath steaming in the cold air. But the yard beyond them was a mess of prints, a story written in the snow by something that had circled and watched in the dark. She stepped down carefully, her collar pulled high. Every step broke the crusted snow with a soft sigh, and with every step she searched for more proof that last night wasn't just a dream born of grief. And then she saw it. Near the porch post, right where she'd seen the smallest wolf stand, there was a depression in the drift. It was round and shallow, circled by those same scattered paw prints. Something lay there, a pale cloth against the white snow, glinting with a fine layer of frost. Her heart didn't just stumble, it fell. She knelt, her fingers shaking so badly she could barely control them as she brushed the snow aside. It was a small bundle, a piece of waxed fabric tied shut with another piece of rawhide. The edges were stiff with cold, but the knot was still firm. When she lifted it, that smell of smoke came back, stronger this time. The smell of a campfire, the smell of someone surviving out there, somewhere. She carried it inside like it was a newborn baby, closing the door against the wind. She set it on the table, right next to Eli's old wooden toy horse, a relic from another life. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps. She untied the knot with careful, fumbling fingers, terrified that even a single wrong move might undo the miracle that was starting to bloom in her chest. Inside the waxed fold was a scrap of paper, brown, wrinkled, yet the writing on it was perfectly clear. The handwriting made her knees give out from under her. It was his. It was Eli's. Not a trick of the snow, not a phantom of the light, not a ghost of her own grief. It was the same careful loops he had used when he carved their names into the barn beam last spring. And the message, as brief as a single breath, cut through every wall of silence that winter had built around her heart. Follow the creek. Lantern marks. I'm alive. The words blurred as her eyes filled with hot, stinging tears. She pressed the note to her chest, feeling the sharp edges of the paper dig into the fabric of her dress, as if to mark her skin with the proof. For a long time she couldn't move. She couldn't even cry. She just listened to the pulse in her ears, a sound that had suddenly transformed from a funeral drum to the rhythm of hope. Then she staggered to the window and looked out at the line of dark trees, the vast unbroken snow, the horizon that had swallowed her boy whole 6 months ago. Somewhere beyond that white curtain, he was alive. Her breath came out as a prayer without words. Behind her the wind rattled the lantern glass again, and through the blur of her tears, she thought she saw a flicker of movement, the same small wolf. It was standing halfway between the barn and the woods, just watching her. It didn't run when she moved closer to the window. It simply stood there, its head tilted, as if it was waiting for her to finally understand. She threw the door open, not caring about the cold that sliced into her lungs. Her voice cracked when she spoke, a sound raw with 6 months of unshed tears. "Tell him I heard you." The animal blinked, slow and calm. Then it turned and padded back into the trees. The rawhide collar glinted one last time before the snow swallowed it whole. Mara stayed there until its tracks were blurred into nothing by the wind, the note still trembling in her hand. For the first time since Eli had vanished, she smiled through her tears. It was the smile of someone who has just remembered what hope feels like. And when she turned back to the table, she didn't blow out the lantern. She lit it again, brighter this time, not to call him home, but to guide herself toward him. By mid-morning, the snow had hardened into a sheet of glass, the kind that cracked under your boot like broken porcelain. The world was sharp and brittle. Mara had been outside twice already. Each time she followed the small wolf's tracks until the wind scrubbed them away, and each time she came back to the cabin with the same breathless conviction. This was real. Her boy had written that note, but certainty, like warmth, couldn't last long in that kind of weather. Doubt was a cold that got into your bones. She needed proof that wasn't just her own. When Jonah Briggs rode up the trail near noon, she nearly ran out to meet him. He was a mountain of a man wrapped in a long duster, his hat rimmed with frost. He was the sort of man who never spoke first because silence had never done him any harm. His horse snorted, a plume of white steam rising around them. "Mara," he said, his voice a low rumble, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," she said, her voice shaking. She handed him the note. Jonah turned it over in his big gloved hands. His thumb traced the creases in the paper, as though he was reading the story of its journey. His brow tightened. "This Eli's hand?" he asked, his eyes never leaving the paper. "You carved his name into the fence post with him last year. You tell me." Jonah nodded slowly. "Sure looks like it. Where'd you find this?" "Outside, on the porch, wrapped in cloth, tied with rawhide." He finally looked up, his gaze sharp. "You think he's alive?" "I know it," she said, stepping closer. Her eyes were shining with a fierce light, the way firelight shines through a glass of whiskey. "A wolf brought it, Jonah. The smallest one of the pack. It had his collar on its neck." Jonah looked at her for a long, hard time. The wind scratched and hissed through the pines behind them. "Mara, you sure you weren't just seeing shapes in that storm last night?" Grief can play tricks on a person. Her jaw set like stone. "Would the storm write this?" she snapped, snatching the paper back from him and holding it right under his nose. "He's alive, Jonah. He might be hurt, but he's alive, and I'm going after him." Jonah studied her face, seeing the raw, bleeding edges of her exhaustion and the wild tremble of faith that made her stronger than any logic. He finally let out a long breath through his teeth, a cloud of white in the cold air. "Then we better find him before the next snow buries them tracks for good." He dismounted, tied his horse, and started for the shed without another word. Together they pulled out the old sleigh runner and laid boards across it for their supplies. The work was hard and fast, a silent agreement between them. "You still got that lamp oil?" he asked, not looking at her. "Half a flask?" "Good," he grunted. "Lantern light travels farther in this kind of cold, especially when it's fueled by hope." She looked up at him sharply. "That's all I've been living on." Jonah actually smiled, a faint, rare thing. It was the kind of smile a man gives when he's impressed and doesn't want to admit it. They loaded blankets, matches, dried bread, and the bottle of oil. When the sleigh was finally ready, Mara stepped back inside the cabin one last time. She reached out and touched the rawhide cord hanging by the door. It was stiff now, frozen solid at the knot. She carefully tucked it into her coat pocket. "He trained that pup," she said softly, more to herself than to him. "He told me once that they remember kindness better than men do." Jonah nodded, his eyes on the tree line. "Then maybe it remembers the way home." The wind howled again, lower this time, almost a groan from the earth itself. Jonah glanced toward the trees, his hand resting on the stock of the rifle slung over his back. "You hear that?" She did. It wasn't the sound of the full pack. It was just one call, sharp, short, and close. Too close. "That's him," she whispered. They both turned as the small wolf emerged from behind a snowbank. It was limping, its ears pinned back, and it watched them with the eerie stillness of a creature that understands far too much. Around its neck, the rawhide collar glinted in the pale light. "Well," Jonah said quietly, his voice full of something like awe. "Looks like we got ourselves a guide." Mara's hand tightened on the handle of her lantern. "Then let's follow him before the light fades." And as the wolf turned and started toward the ridge, she felt something strange and unfamiliar beat beneath her ribs. It was something warmer than fear and older than reason. It felt like faith wearing the face of a miracle. They set out before the day could decide what color it wanted to be. The sky wasn't blue, it wasn't gray. It was the pale, flat color of old tin. Every sound felt like it was borrowed from silence. Jonah walked ahead, his big boots crunching a deliberate path in the snow. The sleigh rope was looped around his arm, and he leaned into it like a man hauling the weight of the world. Mara followed close behind, her lantern raised high. Its flame was a small, brave defiance against the endless wind. The little wolf moved just ahead of them. Sometimes it would trot, and sometimes it would pause. glancing back as if to make sure they were still there. The rawhide collar glimmered faintly against its dark fur, and every time Mara saw it, her chest ached with a dizzying mix of hope and disbelief. This couldn't be real, but it was. The land around them was a sea of white, stitched together by the black threads of dead trees. Now and then they passed the skeletal remains of a fence swallowed by snow, or a half-fallen trapper's marker. It was a world half erased, but not forgotten. The creek appeared after an hour. It was a frozen ribbon of ice coiling through the plain. Mara knelt and brushed the snow from its surface until she saw them. Faint scratches along the edge. Marks made in charcoal, spaced out like footprints. "Lantern marks," she whispered, her voice catching. Jonah knelt beside her, studying them. "Your boy's thinking clear. That's good. That's real good." They followed the line downstream. Every few hundred yards, they would set another lantern on a snowbank, lighting it with trembling hands until a trail of small, lonely suns burned behind them in the gloom. "He'll see them when he wakes," Mara said softly. Jonah didn't say anything. He just nodded and kept moving. The wind started to carry a new scent. Not just pine sap, but something older. Wood smoke. Faint, but real. It pulled Mara forward, made her walk faster. Then came a sound that didn't belong to the storm. A low growl rolling through the stillness. A sound that came from a deep chest and a hungry belly. She froze. Across the creek, shadows were moving between the trees. More wolves. The rest of the pack. They were watching from the darkness. Their shapes were almost impossible to distinguish from the tree trunks. Only their eyes, pairs of burning yellow dots, gave them away. Jonah's hand went to his rifle. He started to raise it, but Mara caught his sleeve. "No," she said, and her voice was surprisingly steady. "They're not hunting us." He looked at her like she was crazy. "Then what in God's name are they doing?" "Guarding," she said. The little wolf, their guide, turned to face its kin. It gave a short, clipped whine, and just like that, the shapes receded, melting back into the forest like smoke into air. The burning eyes vanished. Jonah lowered his rifle slowly. "I ain't never seen that before." Mara allowed herself another small, trembling smile. Maybe kindness echoes longer than we think. They walked until the sun finally gave up and bent westward. Color decided to exist again. Amber bled into gray, and the horizon wore a thin, perfect halo of gold. The lanterns they'd left behind them flickered like fallen stars marking their way home. When the wind died down for a moment, they heard it, the sound of water trickling under the ice somewhere up ahead. Jonah raised a hand, stopping her. "You smell that?" he asked. It was wood smoke again, but fresh this time. Close, and it was mixed with something sweet, like burning pine cones. Mara's heart didn't just stumble this time. It hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She gripped the lantern so tight her knuckles turned white. "He's near." They found the remnants of a small camp in a hollow in the snow. The ashes in a small fire pit were cold, but they were fresh. A half-burned log lay beside it. A tin cup was frozen to the ground. Jonah crouched and picked up a strip of cloth that was caught on a branch, brittle with frost. "Shirt sleeve," he said, his voice grim, child-sized. Mara turned the lantern toward the trees, her own voice swallowed by the wind. "Eli!" Then came an answering sound. Not a human voice, not the howl of a beast, but something in between. A soft whine followed by the sound of paws padding through the snow. The little wolf appeared again. It stopped just out of arm's reach, and Mara's stomach tightened into a cold, hard knot. Around its neck, the rawhide collar now hung looser. Something had been removed from it. "Where's the note?" she whispered, the words barely audible. The animal stepped closer. It pressed its head lightly against her glove, a fleeting touch of warmth. Then it backed away toward the woods. Jonah's eyes widened. "He's leading us again." She lifted the lantern higher, the flame inside trembling as much as her hand, and she followed. The wind rose once more, but this time its voice didn't sound like grief. It sounded like a direction. The forest thickened fast until daylight became something you remembered, instead of something you could see. Branches, heavy with snow, reached down low, brushing against their coats as if to test their resolve. Mara's lantern cast moving, dancing gold across bark that was slick with frost. Every flicker of the flame turned the shadows around them into living things. The small wolf padded ahead through the narrowing path. Its tail was a faint pendulum, a rhythm of faith in motion. Twice it stopped to look back, waiting for her to keep up. And each time it did, she whispered a name for it. Ash. She called it Ash because the color of its fur reminded her of the last fire Eli had built before he vanished into the white. Jonah had stopped questioning why she was talking to an animal. Some faiths just weren't meant to be explained. The creek curved hard to the east, then widened out into a shallow basin, where the current still ran free beneath a thin, cracking sheet of ice. Across the water stood an old willow tree, its trunk split clean in two by lightning long ago. The wound in its wood was black and glistening. The wolf, Ash, halted there. It pawed once at the ice, then trotted to the base of the ancient tree. Mara and Jonah crossed carefully, their boots cracking the frozen sheet in spiderweb lines that immediately filled with whispering, dark water. At the roots of the willow, half hidden under a drift of snow, lay another piece of waxed cloth. It was smaller than the first one, secured not with a knot, but with a sharp twig pushed through its fold. Mara's heart leaped into her throat. She knelt, her fingers raw and clumsy with cold, but steady with purpose. When she opened it, a single strip of paper slid out. The paper was darker than before, damp at the edges. Jonah leaned in close, squinting in the lantern light. The ink was smudged, but it was legible enough to read. I'm hurt. Shelter east of the split willow. Don't bring fire. Wolves help. Mara's breath caught in her throat. The words were a prayer and a warning all at once. He's close, she said, the words feeling almost too sacred to release into the cold air. Jonah straightened up, his eyes scanning the horizon. East will take us toward the ravine. That's rough ground, Mara. He's alive, Jonah. That's all that matters. She looked down at Ash, who stood quietly beside her, snow frosting his back. You brought us this, didn't you? The wolf blinked slowly, then lowered its head, pressing its muzzle against the heel of her boot. It was a gesture that felt more human than beast, a gesture of quiet confirmation. Guess that answers that, Jonah murmured, shaking his head. They started moving again, following the creek as it slanted down into a narrow gorge bordered by walls of red rock. The trail grew cruel. Stones hidden beneath the snow bruised their feet. The lantern's flame fluttered low, threatening to die out completely until Jonah cupped his hand around the glass, protecting it. Don't bring fire, he muttered, thinking out loud. Maybe it scares the wolves off. Maybe it calls something else, Mara said softly, a new kind of fear prickling at her skin. Up ahead, a shape moved along the ridge. It was tall, slow, and it was limping. For one wild heartbeat, she thought it was him. But when she lifted the lantern higher, she saw fur, not cloth. It was another wolf, larger than Ash, as gray as smoke, and its eyes were fixed on them. Then a second one appeared behind it, then a third, until half the pack stood watching them from above, silent and still. The air grew thick, time itself seeming to fold in on itself between her heartbeats. Jonah raised his rifle instinctively, but before he could aim, Ash trotted out to the center of the clearing and barked, just once. A sharp, commanding sound. The wolves on the ridge tilted their heads in unison. Then as one, they turned and disappeared down the far side of the ridge, as silent as mist. They're clearing the way, Mara whispered, her voice filled with awe. Jonah exhaled, lowering the rifle. Lady, he said, his voice rough with emotion, your son's got friends in some mighty strange places. The words made her laugh, a raw, broken sound that turned to ice on her cheeks. No, she said, gripping the precious note tight in her pocket. He just remembered to be kind. They pressed on, the lantern light glancing off the towering ravine walls. The small wolf, Ash, led the way, his rawhide collar glimmering like a promise in the dark. Somewhere up ahead, just beyond the last bend in the rock, the world was waiting to tell them whether faith was enough. They finally stopped where the ravine widened into a shallow hollow, a place half sheltered by fallen pines, and a sharp bend of the red rock wall. The snow here was less cruel, shaped by the wind into soft drifts that looked almost like sleeping bodies in the gloom. Jonah began to unload the sleigh, stacking wood and blankets, while Mara crouched beside Ash. The little wolf had lain down near her boots, its chest rising and falling fast from the miles it had run. When she reached a hand toward it, it didn't flinch. She could see the collar up close now. It was cracked where the rawhide knot had frozen and thawed again and again. A small patch of fur beneath it had been rubbed bare. "You carried his word," she whispered, her voice thick. "You saved him." The wolf's eyes met hers. They weren't the wild, feral yellow she'd always feared. They were amber, warm, living, and aware. Hunger lived in those eyes too, a dull ache as honest as the winter itself. She pulled a strip of dry jerky from her coat pocket, broke it in half, and laid one piece on the snow between them. The wolf sniffed it, uncertain. Jonah turned from the fire pit he was digging in the snow. "You sure about that, Mara?" "If my boy trusted him," she said, her eyes never leaving the wolf, "then so can I." Slowly, cautiously, Ash stepped forward. Each movement was deliberate, a test. When its cold, wet nose brushed against her glove, she felt the tremor of something ancient pass between them. Fear giving way to faith. It took the meat gently, its teeth just barely grazing the leather of her glove. For a single second its muzzle rested in her palm before it backed away to eat. The world around them went still, the kind of stillness that listens. High above the ravine, a hawk's cry echoed once, then faded into nothing. "Never thought I'd live to see that," Jonah said quietly. "Neither did I." Mara smiled, a small, breaking thing, like light breaking through a thick cloud. "Maybe Eli is teaching us both something." The wolf finished its meal, then circled twice and curled up near the lantern, its body folding into the small circle of heat like a shadow, learning what comfort feels like. Jonah poured coffee from a dented tin pot into 2 cups and passed one to her. The steam smelled like life itself. "We rest a bit," he said, his voice low. "Then we follow the creek east till the ridge splits." Mara nodded, but her eyes stayed on the wolf. She thought of Eli as a little boy, maybe 7 or 8, feeding a wounded bird with crumbs from his own breakfast. She remembered how she'd scolded him for it, telling him the world didn't have time for that kind of softness, that it didn't repay kindness. Now, years later, here she was, in the middle of nowhere, learning she'd been wrong from the very creature he had once tried to defend. The thought made her throat tighten. She sipped the coffee, the taste bitter and grounding. Snow drifted lazily down from the ledges above, catching in her hair like silver dust. For the first time since he had disappeared, she didn't feel completely alone. Then the wind shifted, and it carried a sound, faint but unmistakable. 3 knocks, spaced evenly apart. Tap, tap, tap. Jonah stiffened. "That ain't no woodpecker." The wolf lifted its head too, its ears pricked forward. A moment later another sound came. Metal striking stone. Clink, clink. "A signal," Jonah muttered, his eyes wide. "That's human." Mara rose so fast the cup toppled from her hand, the dark coffee hissing as it vanished into the snow. She grabbed the lantern, the flames inside leaping steady and bright despite her shaking hands. "He's close," she breathed. The wolf was already on its feet. It trotted ahead, glancing back at her just once, as if to say, "Now, you follow me." Jonah kicked snow over the small fire, smothering it instantly, and shouldered his rifle. "Lead on, ma'am." The 3 of them, a man, a woman, and a beast, moved out from the small circle of warmth back into the hush of the falling snow. The lantern's light danced over the ravine walls, catching in the wolf's fur like tiny sparks, searching for a home. And for the first time, Mara didn't pray for a miracle. She realized she was already walking inside one. The sound came again, sharper this time. Metal on stone. Clink, clink, clink. Quick, purposeful, like someone striking flint but getting the rhythm all wrong. Mara froze mid-step, every muscle in her body listening. Ash's ears twitched, his whole body leaning toward the noise. East wall, Jonah whispered, his voice barely a breath. They moved cautiously along the ravine, following the echo as it bounced from rock to rock until distance became a lie. The lantern's light brushed across narrow passages, the exposed roots of ancient pines, and patches of open, black water where the ice had cracked. Each reflection made it seem as if they were walking through a world made of broken glass. The smell of smoke grew stronger, but mixed in it now was something bitter. The smell of pitch from green, unseasoned wood. He's burning fresh branches, Jonah muttered, trying to make it last. Mara's pulse hammered in her ears. She wanted to call out his name, to scream it into the wind, but she was terrified that the sound might shatter whatever fragile, invisible bridge lay between them now. They turned another bend, and Ash halted so suddenly that Mara nearly stumbled into him. His tail was low, his body tense. In the snow just ahead of them was a single boot print. It was small and shallow, the impression already filling with meltwater, and beside it, another set of tracks. Wolf prints, not human, circling, protective. Mara dropped to her knees. She pressed her gloved hand into the boot print and felt a faint, residual warmth trapped just beneath the thin crust of ice. He's close, she breathed, the words turning to mist in the air. Jonah scanned the steep slope above them. You see that? Halfway up the ridge, a thin, gray thread of smoke coiled from behind a rock shelf. It was faint, but it was steady. Stay here, he started to say, but she was already moving, scrambling up the slope. I've waited too long to stay anywhere. The climb was brutal. Loose snow slid out from under her boots, and sharp shards of ice cut through her sleeves. But she kept her eyes fixed on that line of smoke, on the impossible idea that hope had a scent, and it smelled like burning pine. Ash stayed below, pacing back and forth, his amber eyes following her every slip in recovery. When she finally pulled herself up onto the shelf of rock, the first thing she saw was the glowing embers of a tiny fire built inside a ring of stones, and beside it, a bundle of furs that stirred when the wind touched it. Eli! Her voice cracked, breaking on his name. The bundle moved again, slower this time, and a voice, raspy and thin as a spider's thread, whispered from within it. Ma! The world stopped turning. Everything went silent except for the rushing in her ears. She dropped to her knees beside him, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she peeled back the heavy fur. His face was pale, his lips cracked and blue, one cheek darkened by the black touch of frostbite. But his eyes, those clear, creek water blue eyes, they were open, and they were real. You came, he whispered. You told me how, she answered, the tears finally coming, freezing on her cheeks before they could even fall. Jonah's heavy boots crunched on the rock behind her, his breath coming in hard, ragged gasps from the climb. He's alive. Alive, she said, laughing and sobbing in the same broken breath. He's alive. Eli tried to sit up, but a sharp gasp of pain bent him back down. Legs caught, he gasped. She looked and saw the crude splint of wood tied with strips of leather around his shin. The desperate work of someone who had done what he could with what he had. Can you walk? Jonah asked, his voice gentle. Eli just shook his head. Not far. Then not far is all we need. They built a sled from fallen branches and the rope from their own sleigh, wrapping him in the warm blankets they'd brought. When they lifted him, he gritted his teeth against the pain, but didn't cry out. The small wolf, Ash, finally scrambled up the slope, his limp more pronounced now. He wagged his tail just once before nudging his cold nose into Eli's hand. Ash, Eli murmured, a faint smile touching his lips. You found her. Mara looked from her son to the wolf, and realization dawned on her like a slow sunrise. You named him. He followed me after I mended his paw, Eli whispered, his voice growing stronger. I knew he'd remember. The boy's small, chapped hand rested on the animal's head. The touch was both fragile and eternal. Jonah secured the rope on the makeshift sled and glanced at the darkening sky. We got maybe an hour of light left, he said grimly, and a storm's coming in behind it. Mara nodded, lifting her lantern high. Below them, the ravine glowed faintly from the line of lanterns they left behind. They looked like a trail of answered prayers leading them home. The storm broke before they could even start down the slope. One moment, the ridge lay still beneath a ceiling of pale, quiet sky. The next, the world folded in on itself, becoming a screaming chaos of white. The wind slammed into them so hard it stole the sound from the air, stole the thoughts from her head. It left only the desperate, frantic need for movement. Jonah shouted something, but the words were ripped away by the wind before they could reach her ears. Mara clung to the rope that held Eli's sled, digging her boots into the shifting snow until she felt the solid bite of frozen earth under the ice. The lantern swung wildly from her belt, its flames straining inside the glass like a captured soul fighting to break free. "Don't let go!" she screamed, though she couldn't even hear her own voice. Ash barked, one sharp, urgent sound that cut through the roar of the wind. Then he darted ahead, down into the blinding swirl of white, a gray phantom carving a path where there was none. They followed him blindly, trusting the rhythm of his instinct more than their own sight. When the ground finally leveled out, Mara realized they had reached the bottom of the ravine. They were back at the creek. Through the blizzard, she recognized one of their own lanterns, half buried in a drift, but still burning faintly. Its soft halo glowed through the snow like an eye of mercy. "Lantern marks," she gasped, the cold air burning her lungs. Jonah bent low beside her, his face a mask of ice. "We follow our own light now." Together they hauled the sled onto the frozen creek, moving from one dim flame to the next. Each lantern flickered and sputtered under the storm's assault, yet each one still burned, as stubborn as faith itself. And then behind them, the wolves appeared again. They came out of the storm like ghosts, silent and gray. They formed a moving wall on either side of the sled, shielding them from the worst of the wind. Mara could hardly feel her hands anymore. They were just numb claws clinging to a rope. But every time she thought her strength was completely gone, she would look down at Eli's face. His eyes were closed, his lips pale. But when she whispered his name, he would answer with a sound that was halfway between a breath and a prayer. "I'm here, Ma." That was enough. It had to be. They reached the basin where the old split willow stood, its ancient trunk creaking and groaning under the weight of the new snow. Ash stopped there. He turned to face her, lifted his head, and howled. It was one long, rising note that cut through the storm like a blade of truth through fear. The rest of the pack, hidden in the storm, answered from the ridge. Their voices threaded together into a strange and beautiful harmony, until the very air around them vibrated with the sound. Jonah stared upward into the white chaos, his face a picture of pure awe. "I'll be," he muttered. "They're calling the wind off us." For a moment it seemed true. The howling gusts softened. The heavy flakes fell slower. And through the sudden, strange quiet, Mara could hear the faint, hopeful burble of water running somewhere beneath the ice. "Don't bring fire," she whispered to herself, remembering the note. But maybe light was allowed. She untied the lantern from her belt and set it on the ice. She watched its glow spread through the frozen layer, turning the surface into a river of gold trapped just beneath the glass. A river of light stretching west, toward home. "We follow the light," she said. Jonah nodded, pulling on the rope again. The wolves moved with them, flanking the sled in a solemn, silent formation. For miles they trudged, guided by that trembling river of light, until the first dark outlines of their own fences appeared through the storm. Black lines drawn against the swirling white. Then came the smell of their own chimney smoke, drifting across the plain. Mara almost fell to her knees with relief. "We're close," she said, though her voice was barely air. The wolves began to slow, their task ending as the familiar landscape appeared. Ash was the last to leave. He walked beside her for a few more steps, his fur matted with frost and ice. When the first lantern of home came into view, the one she had left burning in her own window that night, Mara laughed. It was a sound both bright and broken. "You did it," she told the wolf. It blinked at her once, then turned toward the dark line of trees, leaving paw prints that the storm immediately began to erase. She watched until even the shadow of its tail had vanished into the night. Then she lifted Eli's hand and pressed its coldness to her cheek. "We're home," she whispered, as the storm finally laid itself to rest behind them. When the cabin finally appeared through the thinning veil of snow, it looked less like a building and more like a memory taking shape. It was a faint outline of what Hope had imagined on every one of those long, cold nights she'd waited. The lantern she had left burning in the window still flickered, its flame trembling against the frost, refusing to surrender. Mara stumbled the last few yards, the rope dragging heavy and dead in her numb hands. Jonah caught her arm just before she fell, guiding her up the icy steps. Together they lifted Eli inside, laying him gently on the bed near the stove. The room smelled of cedar and old ashes. It smelled of a home that had been half asleep and waiting. Jonah struck a flint to tinder, and soon the first welcome crackle of fire sounded like the start of life itself. Heat spread slowly through the small room, as cautious as a winter dawn. Mara knelt beside her boy, her breath catching on the ragged edge of joy and disbelief. Eli, she whispered, brushing the frost from his hair. His eyelids fluttered open. They were heavy, but his voice came out clear enough to split her heart right open. You came. She smiled through the tears she could no longer hide. You called me, you and your wolves. He gave a faint, short laugh that ended in a cough. Did they listen? Better than men ever did. She turned to Jonah. We need water, hot water. He nodded and filled the kettle from the snow bucket by the door. Outside, the wind sighed one last time, then drifted away like a tired ghost. The silence that followed was thick and heavy with peace. Mara wrapped Eli's frozen hands in hers, feeling life return to them, warmth by warmth. How long were you out there? Since the first snow, he whispered. The fall broke my leg. The river carried me down past the ridge. Ash, he stayed with me. He brought me scraps from old traps, bits of jerky someone had dropped, even a rabbit once. His eyes found hers. When I couldn't move anymore, I tied the note to him. I didn't think he'd make it. She squeezed his hand. He remembered kindness. His eyes softened. You used to say the world forgets things like that. I was wrong, she said. The admission lifted from her chest like a physical weight dropping into deep water. Jonah brought the steaming kettle and poured a mug. Sip this slow, he told Eli. You'll feel the fire in your chest long before you feel it in your hands. Eli nodded weakly, drinking. Mara watched the color slowly return to his face. She watched the dark frostbite fade to a healthy pink around his ears, and she felt a profound gratitude settle deep in her bones, the way heat settles into wood, deep, invisible, and lasting. Through the small window, she could see shapes on the distant ridge. The wolves. They were as still as statues, their silhouettes black against the silver sky. They were watching. She rose, stepped to the door, and opened it. The cold air rushed in, but it was followed by a breath of warmth from the stove behind her. Thank you, she said softly into the night. The smallest shape moved, a gray flicker that she knew by heart. Ash gave one brief bark, a sound that was more of a farewell than a claim. Then he turned and disappeared into the trees. The rest of the pack followed without a sound, the fresh snow swallowing their passage. Mara stood there until even the tracks had faded. When she came back inside, Eli was asleep, his hands still curled around the warm mug, his face turned toward the fire. Jonah sat by the table, mending the torn rawhide collar, his expression unreadable in the firelight. You fixing that for him? She asked quietly. He shrugged, not looking up. For whoever needs it next. She smiled, understanding more than the words he'd said. The lantern still burned on the windowsill, its light softer now, content. Mara reached out and adjusted the wick until it glowed steady and calm. The storm had taken everything it could from her. Everything except faith. And tonight, faith had walked home on four legs. By the time the sun rose, the storm had spent itself completely. The prairie lay smooth and unbroken, a white ocean beneath a sky as clean and clear as new glass. Smoke from the cabin chimney curled upward in lazy, peaceful ribbons, carrying the scent of cedar and fresh coffee into the morning air. Mara stepped outside, wrapped in Eli's old, oversized coat. Her boots sank into snow that no longer fought against her. The cold still bit at her cheeks, but it felt honest now, a reminder of what they had endured rather than a punishment. She held the lantern in both hands. Its glass was freshly polished, and its flame burned steady and calm in the soft wind. For the first time in 6 months, the light in her hand was no longer a plea. It was gratitude. Behind her inside the warm cabin, she could hear Jonah humming quietly to himself while Eli slept, the boys breathing deep and even. The wolves had not returned, yet their presence lingered, as if the world itself had taken on a gentler shape overnight. She walked to the edge of the yard, where the clean snow met the dark tree line, and she stopped. There, half buried, lay the rawhide collar that Jonah had mended. It was knotted tight, the leather dark and supple with oil. She picked it up, running her thumb along its smooth grain. "You carried our hope," she whispered to it, knowing that the creature it had once belonged to was already far beyond the distant hills. In the distance, a single howl rose. It was faint, almost a question on the wind. She smiled. "We're fine now," she said softly, though the wind carried no reply. Turning back toward the cabin, she caught sight of a faint line of paw prints stretching out across the plain, glistening where the new sunlight touched them. They seemed endless, leading toward the far horizon like a written promise. She followed them with her eyes until they disappeared into the bright glare of the sun on the snow. And in that moment, she finally understood what faith truly was. It wasn't about believing in miracles. It was about having the quiet courage to keep the lantern lit when the night gives you no reason to. She walked back to the porch. She hung the rawhide collar on the nail by the door, right beside where Eli's coat would soon hang again. She set the lantern back on the windowsill. Its glow reflected in the frost like a second sunrise. Inside, the fire cracked softly. Jonah looked up from his chair. "World still standing out there?" he asked. "Better than before," she said, removing her gloves. "He's still sleeping," Jonah said, "like a child who knows the dark can't touch him anymore." She smiled at that. She crossed the room and sat in the chair beside the bed, watching her son's chest rise and fall beneath the heavy quilt. The color had returned to his face, a faint pink halo against the white pillow. She reached out and brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. For a moment, time folded in on itself. He was 5 years old again, asleep after a long day of mending fences, the same perfect curve of peace on his mouth. She leaned close, whispering a thank you she didn't know how to finish. Then she looked toward the window. Outside, the light had shifted, turning the edges of the world to gold, painting the snow in hues of fire and forgiveness. The lantern's reflection flickered across her eyes. She reached out and lowered the wick, dimming the flame until it became just a quiet, steady heartbeat inside the glass. The day didn't need its help anymore. From somewhere far beyond the ridge, a wolf's call lifted one last time, carried on the clean, cold morning air. It wasn't a cry of hunger, not a warning, but something that sounded a lot like farewell. Mara listened until it faded, her hand still resting on Eli's. Then she whispered the only words that fit inside that perfect, peaceful silence. 10 wolves surrounded my cabin once, but the smallest one carried my son home. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the edge of the wild. If you had been her that night, lantern shaking in her hand, hope shining through her tears, would you have opened the door when the wolves came? Tell us in the comments below.